Welcome to the Library Love Fest podcast. I'm Virginia Stanley.
I'm Lainey Mays.
And Essie Ramirez.
We are the library marketing team at HarperCollins Publishers.
Join us every week as we present buzzworthy books through author interviews, conversations with editors, and expert opinions from librarians like you.
Enjoy the show.
Book Buzz, HarperCollins Book Buzz. Check it out. Do-do-do, Book Buzz, HarperCollins Book Buzz. Brought to you by Library Love Fest.
Hi everyone, it's Lainey from the Library Love Fest team. I am joined for another episode of Editors Unedited by a returning editor, Julie Will. Hi, Julie.
Hi, Lainey.
Hi, Julie is the Vice President, Editorial Director at Harper Wave, and she has an exciting episode for us, so I'm going to hand it over.
Thanks, Lainey. Well, I'm thrilled to introduce co-authors and dynamic duo of the culinary world, Daniel Holzman and Matt Rodbard, authors of Food IQ, 100 Questions, Answers, and Recipes to Raise Your Cooking Smarts. Daniel is the founder chef of the Meatball Shop restaurants in New York City and co-author of the Meatball Shop Cookbook. A sought-after educator and recipe writer, Daniel has been published in the New York Times and many other publications and has appeared on shows such as Today, Good Morning America, CBS This Morning, The Tonight Show, The Martha Stewart Show, and many, many more. Matt is the founding editor-in-chief of the James Beard Award-winning online food magazine Taste and is the co-author of Koreatown, a cookbook, a New York Times bestseller. He's been published in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Bon Appetit, GQ, Travel and Leisure, Lucky Peach, and many more. Matt is the host of the Taste podcast, featuring interviews with thought leaders in food and media. And they're both here today. Hi, guys.
Wow, what an introduction. I feel like we need to, do you have any accolades that we can,
seriously.
We can start? I feel like you're...
Julie Will is the editor of Food IQ.
You are.
It's soon to be a New York Times bestseller.
Yes. Thank you for having us.
Thanks for being here. So, where I'd love to start is to kind of talk about the genesis of the book, the inspiration for the book. I just read these lengthy bios and people know about your amazing experience, but people might not know how you two came together. And I know the relationship that inspired the questions that make up the book, but I would love to hear a little bit about that evolution from you guys, and maybe just to help the listeners identify voices. Maybe Matt, you could kick it off.
Sure. Thanks, Julie. Daniel and I have known each other for a decade. I met him when I was writing about his restaurant, The Meatball Shop, which he opened in Lower East Side. He was, a chef. I was a writer. We were interviewing each other. I was interviewing him, and really we clicked right away. And we continued this relationship that has grown from a chef writer to a real friendship. So over the course of the past decade, we've both written together, we've podcasted together, and it's basically been me and Daniel riffing on food ideas. And we got to the idea of this book when Daniel's like, I've been answering Matt's questions and we've been talking about food. Why don't we just put it down on paper and write it down? What do you think, Daniel? That sounds about right?
Yeah, I feel like we met, and early on, I had always kind of been interested in writing a little bit, and Matt took me on as somebody Matt was the only person that said, hey, actually, if you're interested in writing in earnest, maybe we should co-author a column together. And I was really excited about that. So we started writing together, I guess it was 8 years ago. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
A long time, time, a long history.
It's the questions really came from a place of me as the writer being like, let's demystify all these topics that I might know a little bit about as a food writer, but don't know the deeper meaning of, like which potato to use when mashing or roasting. You go to the grocery store and you look at like 6 to 10 to 20, depending on the size of different potatoes. I was just shopping yesterday. And it still makes my head spin. But for Daniel, it's natural. He's like, the Yukon Gold is for, fries. But like, let's take 199 more of those was the idea, and like really have this conversation. And that's where the book came from.
So that takes us to another good point, which is there are so many questions and there are so many ways this book could have gone. So sort of how did you guys go about wrapping your arms around that? And what did you use as sort of your guiding principles of, what belongs in the book, what doesn't belong in the book, what is an essential piece of culinary knowledge, what is maybe the next level up for readers that they might not have thought of, how did you go about that?
I think we just send like a free form manuscript, and we had this amazing editor that helped us put it all together.
It's a good question. I mean, we started from a couple sources. First, we sent a survey to like 100 of our closest friends, people in the industry, and really wanted to get a sense of what were the burning questions out there. And we got a sense right away that people wanted to know about technology and cooking gear. There's so much out there, but right away, like, should I buy this knife or that knife? Should I buy an Instapot, etc.? We go into detail. We have a whole section about that. But also, leveling up is a really important idea and facet here, where we know that there are a lot of cooks out there and home cooks who have this foundation of knowledge. It's not like we're not in the era of like, I don't know how to boil water. Those people don't exist really. I mean, in my opinion, I feel like most people have a general sense of cooking. So Food IQ is here to level up and really take some of these ideas, these fragments, and put the pieces together. And that's where Daniel's skill really came in when talking about these 100 questions. And for the record, it was impossible to pick 100. Like, we were really struggled with that. And there's many more to come.
I mean, I guess to that point, we talked a lot about the audience for this book, and we were calling it sort of Foodie 2.0.
Yeah.
And, this book was also, I don't know if it was conceived of, but it was, it was shopped and acquired during the sort of the height of the pandemic, right? At a time when people became really, even more invested in cooking and sort of upping their cooking game and taking on these special projects. Like, I'm curious, as a chef and a food writer and avid home cook, what do you think it is about cooking that really resonated so strongly with people in the last, let's just call it 2 years?
You feel like,
I know, small question.
Well, I mean, during at a time where folks were forced to cook, really forced to cook for themselves and for their families for the first time, I think that the lack of institutional cooking knowledge became, just extremely evident. And, so I just read recently an amazing quote, and I'm so sad that I don't remember where it was from. This idea that in life we're constantly looking for great returns from small investments, and cooking is one of the few examples of a place where you can find that. You can put a small investment into learning how to cook, and you get amazing returns. It's one of the greatest gifts you can give yourself and your family. And you want to be popular at a party, you bring great dip. And this, that idea for us is very special. Being able to teach people how to cook is kind of giving folks that gift, right?
I agree fully. And I just will add that the idea of the Foodie 2.0, the second generation foodie, is real. And this isn't just a pandemic phenomenon. We know that these skills acquired in the past 18 months are going to be, and these interests are going to be prolonged beyond. But I think to add to what it is to be a foodie, and we embrace that term, it is not the new F word at all. It is a wonderful term. And I think, you can bring your own dip to the party, but you can also bring the knowledge, talking about cooking with the whole fish, talking about deglazing, which, might not be cocktail party fodder, but actually when you talk about cooking at your party with your friends, you're like, okay, I roasted that piece of really great beef, and I have this thing in the pan that's called fond, and I want to get it out. I want to add flavor. That's deglazing. One example of 100. But I think there's cultural currency with this food knowledge that you're going to gain for Food IQ. It's not just how to make food, it's how to talk about food.
Right.
Huge point in our book, because we can't go and cook every day. We know that, but we can certainly talk about food every day. And Daniel Holzman, how about that, is one of the better people about talking about food, right?
And I actually get to cook every day, so I get my cake and I eat it too.
No, that's true.
I guess on the tail end of, going back to the pandemic idea, you guys really created this book at a time when there were a lot of restrictions on how much sort of FaceTime. I mean, in real life FaceTime you could have with each other, and with travel. And, Daniel was in LA, Matt was in Brooklyn for most of it. I was in the city and I couldn't even see Matt until this year. But how did the logistics of that sort of impact the creation of, manuscript development, photo shoots, recipe development and testing, all the things that go into making a cookbook?
I mean, I think that the benefit of having to be stuck at home is really apparent on the pages of the book, because Matt and I poured 100% of our energies into this project. And how often do you see your dearest friends that you don't work with? Hopefully more than I do or Matt does. He's a busy guy. I've got a fairly busy job. And so, with modern technologies and being able to get on, on FaceTime or Zoom FaceTime, we spent the better part of a year in each other's homes from across the country.
Yeah. A good question, Julie. These books that are coming out now and into the next spring and into next summer and fall, these are unique books. These are pandemic books. Extremely difficult to make these books. We both have written books in the before times, but to Daniel's point, we were able to really focus on the home cooking. We were able to, cook these recipes top to bottom and test them and retest them. But really, the challenge did come, about during the photo shoots and not being in the same location. But I think the restraint that we had created a really unique book, in that we're really locked in on the concept. We weren't distracted with other ideas. And our book, particularly, I feel like really came out better than ever because Daniel and I were able to focus on the 100 questions. And really, during the process of writing it, we were editing and changing the questions because they were coming up all the time in our feeds, in our lives, from our friends. So it was pretty cool.
I think we might have actually written 103 questions.
I think so.
Hard to keep track of.
I feel like the original version of the manuscript I received had more than 100 questions. Is that true? Am I imagining?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. We didn't design it with numbers. So, if you're a close reader, maybe you want to count them up and we'll see. Maybe there are actually no.
I mean, from like a nuts and bolts perspective, Matt had a whole spreadsheet, which, he had color coded. There were multiple columns constantly being added because as we, there were like, you write the question, then you come up with the answer, and then you've got the recipe, and then you got the interview, and then you've got the adjunct, professor who's adding to the conversation, and each one was expanding. And then there was the, whether there's going to be a photo, and then maybe there'll be an illustration. And so I think somewhere along the line we've got a 100-page.
Yeah,
we've
100 question.
Yeah, way more than 100 pages.
I'll just add to, I think it's important to note that this book is not just in the voice of Daniel and I. I think one big part of it is bringing knowledge from over 50 interviews we did with experts. Many of them are in Q&A form and really easy to read and digest. And that's so important when really raising your food IQ is not just Daniel and I's knowledge, but folks like Roy Choi, Ina Garten, Eric Repair. The list goes on. We interviewed Yoda Naralangi about hummus. We had all these Therese Nelson about the history of fried chicken. We really had these wonderful voices and dialogues with experts in the field. And that was cool during the pandemic because, oftentimes these folks aren't even available to answer their phone, but we were able to get them on the Zoom because, no one's doing anything. So it's a cool book. There's a lot in there and there's a lot of surprises in there.
Yeah, the interviews just add another layer. The conversation between the two of you is ongoing, and then these contributions from all these incredibly talented folks, it just really deepens the reader's appreciation of all of these topics. I'm wondering, do you guys have, in the process of creating, your Google Doc and your spreadsheet, is there a question that fell by the wayside that you're still thinking about? Is there a favorite that didn't make it into the book?
Wow, that's such a great question. What's a question what's the 101st best question?
Oh my gosh, I feel like we cut a lot.
I feel like there were a lot of tools and technology that we struggled with, but the hardest chapter for us was, talking about how do we frame the most iconic dishes or our favorite dishes, and then we got it down to, hey, there are going to be 12 dishes in this chapter, but how do you pick your favorite 12 dishes, right? There's a chicken basquez that all three of us, Matt's wife, who I'll include because she was intimately involved in the communication, that all three of us agreed on needed to make the book, but the other 11 were absolutely difficult, and there are so many iconic dishes from around the world that we wanted to find in this chapter.
I mean, just landing on a burger was something that we debated, and we have our top 5 burgers in there, and just getting the right recipe. That was just something, you're like, okay, what is there anything else to say about the burger? Well, apparently there is, because that was like one of our longest questions and just difficult to really parse out. I mean, I think that there's questions that are always popping up about gear, about grills. Like, we didn't really get into the gear of the grill. I mean, that's its own book, to be honest. Outdoor cooking. I mean, Daniel built his own grill during the pandemic, and like we were like, oh, we should have like actually talked about the grill more, but we actually didn't. I mean, it's one of those things that there's always going to be a new ingredient that comes up and is asked about. Like, this idea of chili crisp has been perpetuating in food media. We didn't really tackle chili crisp except for we had a recipe for our own, but there's just like always things popping up, Daniel, right?
Yeah, I feel like that's the fun of food, is that the trend is constantly evolving. New ingredients are constantly being imported or found or rediscovered. We talk about the clay cooker in the cookbook, which is like, a phenomenon of the 70s, and is completely relevant today, and how cooking in that device translates from cooking in the Instapot. And it's like, we're as home cooks or as chefs, it's our job to reinvent and rediscover, and as home cooks, it's our pleasure.
On that note, do you have a favorite, not necessarily a favorite question or favorite recipe, but I guess a favorite investigation, right? As you were exploring all the different topics for the book, and I'm sure you went down plenty of rabbit holes, like, was there one that taught you something, especially important to you?
I feel like brown butter proved to be extremely difficult. As a chef, when someone asks you a question like, how do you use brown butter? What is brown butter? Pretty straightforward and simple. But then when you try and track down where it came from, and why do people use it? Who was the first person to use it? Where's the first? There was a real rabbit hole and an investigation. Brown butter kind of exploded onto the scene in certain countries, so it doesn't exist in one, from 1 month 20 years ago, and then all of a sudden it's everywhere in a country the next month. So that was a really fun one to investigate. And there's a lot of scientific kind of like, we tried to break down some of the science and get it in there without being, boring, because the goal is certainly not to write a boring book. And I can ramble on if you're.
I mean, I really like talking about the wok, because I thought, like, I wrote a book about Korean food with a friend, and I thought I knew a bit about wok cookery, but man, when we started diving into the wok, it started like it was like an onion. Like, the idea that the wok, use the edges of it for a higher heat, and then you can use it as a moat in the center, and like just rethinking about how using that structure. Also, just talking to Shirley Chung, I think like getting her insight into how she uses woks, and really the idea of like keeping it clean and keeping it not rusted. And
there are two different types of woks, it turns out.
Exactly, that was the other point. Yeah, there's 2 different types of wok, which I always thought it was a singular vessel, a singular cooking piece of gear. And
I just feel like when you write a book, it's something permanent, but usually you can kind of futz it and not necessarily get the facts perfectly right. But in this book, where we're really saying, hey, this is the science behind it, this is we had the pleasure, it was the most fun part probably, of really having to delve in and learn really having to delve in and learn. That was kind of, I mean, for me, that was definitely the best part about writing this book.
And I'll just say too, it's important to add that with this, like, shout out to the librarians out there, you can read this book and cook from it. So each of these questions, you're going to learn about the walk. You can be sitting in the library reading about the walk and reading Shirley's interview. But then Daniel has come up with a recipe to go with each of these questions that you can then apply, go home, take it home and cook from it, and get the real, like, you know, the vibe of what this answer really means by actually having this recipe, which we kind of consider more like an experiment. So like we have these wok blister green beans with black bean sauce, this beautiful recipe for like the best green beans I've had in a minute. And so it kind of connects the dots in a cool way. It's not just trivia. And I love that part about Food IQ.
Trivia Illustrated.
Yeah, trivia plus application.
Well, yeah, education and plus application. Really, I mean, it's an entertaining way to be educated, and then, you know, with that knowledge, you can
Visual, visceral, and
tangibly, right.
Yeah,
and verbal, visual, verbal, and visceral.
Love it.
It's education to the max.
Yeah,
we got a couple taglines to throw in there. Come on,
we're doing it.
We use this for copy. Well, I think we're getting close to the end. I wanted to just have a little fun here. Not that we haven't been having fun. I've been having fun the whole time. But in the book we had something called Marry, F, or Kill, and I was going to replicate that here and decided to tone it down a little bit.
Too spicy.
We're going to call it. We're going to call it date. We're going to call it date, kiss, or
hold hands.
Admonish. Date, kiss, or admonish with Matt and Dan.
I was also daunted by trying to come up with topics clever enough for you guys. So instead, I chickened out and I thought we might do overappreciated, underappreciated, or overhyped, underhyped.
Oh,
yeah.
So I'm just going to give you categories, and I'd love to hear your responses.
Great.
All right. Most overhyped appliance and underhyped.
Sous vide machine.
Immersion
is overhyped.
circulator, overhyped. The worst.
We just say the same one.
Yeah, the same
time?
one. I mean,
we literally just
like,
said
you know, you take the French version.
I call sous vide,
and I'll call it an immersion circulator because I'm from America.
They both agree it's a meat foot bath.
Yeah, it is, and there's been a lot of cookbooks about it, and you know, bless those folks. But I think for underrated, for me, mortar and pestle. You know, it's not just for making guacamole, which is pretty dope if you go to, like, you know, cool restaurant, but I think you use it all the time. And I think getting your grinding whole spices in a mortar pestle is amazing.
I'm so embarrassed to agree with you. Jesus, this is terrible. We're so simpatico. That mortar and pestle is something that I pull down from the shelf and I use all the time because, you know, cleaning the spice grinder is a pain in the butt. And there's so many different applications for it. Definitely. Grinding salt so that it's fine enough to season popcorn where the salt doesn't fall to the bottom of the bowl without making the popcorn greasy. All you have to do is make it powdered.
Yeah.
Who knew?
So smart.
We learned that when we were writing this cookbook.
Yeah.
Called Food IQ.
Yeah.
All right. Well, then let's go. Since you both love the mortar and pestle so much, what about overhyped, underhyped spice?
Salt is definitely the most underhyped. If you had a desert island that wasn't surrounded by seawater, that's what I'd bring with me.
I agree. Underhyped because you aren't parsing the difference between brands of kosher salt. Morton's and Diamond Crystal are two different products. We write about that. We also write about how the pink salt is pretty overrated. So not to segue to that, like that stuff is more aesthetic, but all the different types of salt that you can buy really actually mean something. And we
pretty things are nice to look at, but it's the substance we're looking for.
Right. So salt's a good one. I mean, overrated for me, man, how do I do this without creating an international incident? Because I would say, I don't know. I feel like I'll just say I've written too many articles about za'atar. I love it. I love the flavor of it. It is a spice from the Middle East, and
is it a spice or is that a spice medley? You know,
it's more of a blend, but you can also get the live za'atar. but it doesn't go good. It's not good on everything. I think I'm guilty of writing that. So
Nutmeg. I'm calling nutmeg because
No.
nutmeg is just not my. It's like, when was the last time that you were like, "Ooh, I can taste the nutmeg"? That's really driving my senses. Like, nutmeg is something that, when as a chef, you put it in there, it lays a base, but if you can taste it, you put too much, unless you're making what's that creamy, disgusting stuff that people drink around Christmas?
Eggnog.
Oh,
That was going to be on my Mary F. Kill list. I was going to do a holiday edition.
I'm marrying eggnog because she's a delicious beast.
Yeah, we're actually going to go there. We are not too spicy for the library. I'd say I am going to F Mary. Or I'm going to F the eggnog because it's just one of those like quick and over kind of things. God damn. Woo, one time a season and that's it. That's all I need.
Yeah. I think we have time for one last over/under hype, and then we got to wrap it up. I'll kind of leave this to you. I was going to say dish or ingredient. I'll leave it up to you guys.
What dish is really,
Overrated.
Man, we wrote, look, hummus, man. I think they got to put hummus back in its place. It's like hummus is really overstepping here.
Yeah.
I don't know when hummus became an entree. I don't want to say I don't like hummus because hummus is extremely delicious. We wrote about why it's important to make your own hummus at home because hummus is this. It really is it's almost ambrosia on one level, but like, did they really just eat ambrosia all day long? I think hummus is at this point overrated. Is that horrible to say?
It's not a bad idea. I would say this. Underrated is pour over coffee is coffee. Coffee as an ingredient or as a dish, I consider it a dish because you create a recipe, we have one, and you make it. And coffee is just undervalued and underappreciated in our society. We don't pay enough for it.
Waking up late for this and not being caffeinated, I would have to agree. Before this, I would not have agreed, but I got to say that coffee really would have gone a long way.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Matt and Daniel, thank you so much for your time. It's been really fun to have this conversation. I just want to remind all of our librarians listening that Food IQ goes on sale February 22nd, 2022.
Oh, thank you for having us.
Thank you for listening to the Library Love Fest podcast. For more information on this week's episode, go to librarylovefest.com. Enjoying the show? We would love to hear what you think. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Library Love Fest and on Instagram at Harper Library. Be sure to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and share the show with a friend. Lastly, if you enjoy our show, we bet you'll enjoy all of the other podcasts from HarperCollins publishers. Find a list of shows at harpercollins.com/podcast. See you next week.